Hey guys, this is Durden from the Lifinity Discord. Today we'll be covering part 2 in our tokenomics series, and the topic is token locking. So let's get started. So first of all, why would we want to lock tokens? So there's a problem when you when you don't have locking, and that is that you can't tell who are your long-term holders and who are the short-term speculators. Tokens are just a number in a wallet. They don't show a holder's intentions. And this is what token locking helps us do, is reveal those intentions. So if someone is intending to hold the tokens for a long time, they can lock them up for that time period. And that shows that they will not be selling those tokens for that time period because they are locked. Now, this method was pioneered by Curve, and is commonly known as the VE model. VE stands for vote escrowed, and it's a prefix that's often placed before the token ticker. So for example, Curve, their token is CRV, so their locked tokens are dubbed VE CRV, and we will be using this same method to designate our locked tokens. Yeah, and so this method that Curve pioneered has been very successful, and many projects are utilizing it. And yeah, we're going to be utilizing it too. So let's talk about VE Lifinity. Users, when they have Lifinity tokens, they can choose to lock them up for VE Lifinity. And the time periods that they can choose to lock them up for vary from 7 days to 4 years. The user gets to choose how long they want to lock up their Lifinity. And we have an equation for calculating how many VE Lifinity you will receive depending on the number of Lifinity you lock up and how long you lock them up. And this equation is the amount of VE Lifinity you receive is the number of Lifinity you lock multiplied by the lock period measured in days divided by 1,460, which is the product of, or it is 4 times 365. So it's the number of days in 4 years. So practically what this means is nicely summarized in this graph that we have, where in this example, we're locking 10,000 Lifinity tokens. If we lock it for 4 years, or 1,460 days, then we will get 10,000 VE Lifinity tokens. On the other hand, if we lock it for only 7 days, we'll receive 47.9 VE Lifinity tokens. And anything in between those two, you can linearly interpolate to find how many VE Lifinity you'll receive. But basically, yeah, it increases linearly. And you can see that how long you choose to lock up your Lifinity tokens significantly impacts how many VE Lifinity you receive. All right, so let's talk about some of the properties of VE Lifinity. It's a special type of token. It's not an SPL token like probably most of the tokens that you are familiar with. So one consequence of this is that VE Lifinity will not show up in your wallet. For example, if you open your Phantom wallet and you scroll down, you're not going to see your VE Lifinity. Instead, it's a number that's tied to your account. And we will make it so that when you go to the Lifinity website, we'll have a page where you can view your VE Lifinity balance. So VE Lifinity can have 2 possible states. It can be either locked or unlocking. When you first receive VE Lifinity, it'll be in the locked state. And when it's locked, you can't access any of the Lifinity tokens that it contains. But whenever you want, you can make another transaction that will transition your VE Lifinity to the unlocking state. And in this state, the 2 things happen. One is that the VE Lifinity balance will begin to decay linearly over time. And similarly, the locked Lifinity will begin to unlock linearly over time. So just to give an example of this so it's clear, suppose we lock 100 Lifinity for 4 years, and we receive 100 VE Lifinity, and we begin unlocking. After 2 years, which is half of the lock period, we'll have 100 divided by 2, which is 50 VE Lifinity left because half of it has decayed. And then we'll also have 50 Lifinity that's unlocked and that we can withdraw. After 3 years, we'll have only 25 VE Lifinity, which is just 1/4 of the 100 that we started with, and 75 Lifinity tokens that are unlocked, which is 3/4 of 100. And then after 4 years, your VE Lifinity balance will decay all the way to 0, and all of your Lifinity tokens will be fully unlocked. So this graph illustrates the information we've laid out so far. So in this example, we're locking a fixed number of Lifinity tokens for both 2 years and 4 years. And we can see how they act differently. So first of all, when you lock for 2 years, you only get half as much as you would when you lock them for 4 years. So you can see the starting point of these two lines are different. And then these are the VE Lifinity tokens that you receive for locking up the Lifinity. However, you can see that the slope of these two lines are the same, which means they decay at the same rate, even if you have a different number of them. And then with these other two lines, which is the amount of Lifinity that unlocks over time, at the start, none of them are unlocked, so it's 0. And you can see that they unlock at different rates because the lines have different slopes. With the Lifinity locked for 4 years, it takes 4 years until they fully unlock. Whereas with the one locked for 2 years, of course, it takes 2 years to fully unlock. So same amount of Lifinity, but of course, if you lock for a shorter amount of time, they unlock much quicker. Now, VE Lifinity can be relocked. So for example, if you have VE Lifinity that's locked for 2 years, you can take the Lifinity that's contained in that VE Lifinity and then relock it for 4 years. What that does is it doesn't change the amount of Lifinity that you'll have, but it will increase the amount of VE Lifinity that you'll have. It'll also make it so that the Lifinity will take longer to fully unlock. Before it was just 2 years, and now you're making it 4 years. So it's a trade-off, of course, where you can increase your amount of VE Lifinity, but it means it'll take longer to unlock your Lifinity if you choose to do so. Another property of VE Lifinity is that users can only have one VE Lifinity account per wallet. So for example, you can't have 2-year locked VE Lifinity and 3-year locked VE Lifinity in the same wallet. As an example, if you have 2-year locked VE Lifinity and then you later acquire 3-year locked VE Lifinity, what will happen is that your 2-year locked VE Lifinity will be relocked to 3-year locked VE Lifinity. So the VE Lifinity with the shorter lock period is elongated to match the longer lock period. And if users want to avoid this from happening, they can use separate wallets. Okay, so now that we've talked about how VE Lifinity works, let's think about how this helps align incentives. So the reason for receiving more VE Lifinity the longer you lock is pretty simple. It's that those who lock longer have greater vested interest in the long-term success of the protocol. So they should receive more rewards and they should have more voting power. Next, the non-transferability of VE Lifinity. This is required to enable VE Lifinity to decay. This is a consequence of the way SPL tokens work. This is the main token standard on Solana. Basically, all your tokens in your Phantom wallet, I think, are SPL tokens. And these were designed with static balances in mind, so they can't decay, and we need a new primitive to be able to do that. And that's why we have VE tokens. This is a thing on Solana. It's becoming a thing on Solana. And yeah, VE tokens are non-transferable. So why do we want to make VE Lifinity decay then? Well, VE Lifinity is what determines how much of the protocol's rewards and how much of voting power you have. So for example, if you locked your Lifinity tokens 4 years ago, but now you're only locked for one more day, it doesn't make sense for you to have as much voting power, for example, as you did that 4 years ago when you locked it for 4 years, because now you're only locked for one more day. Or in other words, you're not as committed to the protocol as you were back then when you were going to be stuck with your tokens locked for 4 years. And so basically this, by decaying the VE Lifinity tokens, it matches how much longer you will have to be committed to the protocol. And as that time decreases, your remaining lock time that is, so does your VE Lifinity balance. And this prevents, for example, users from acting maliciously. So back to that example where a user only has one more day, if they had their full VE Lifinity voting power that they did 4 years ago when they first locked, they could make or they could vote maliciously to harm the protocol. And they wouldn't care very much because they're only locked for one more day. And so to prevent situations like that, we make sure that the remaining lock time is correlated to how much rewards and voting power you get. Finally, we have the linear unlock. So as time passes, the Lifinity that you locked gradually unlocks. So this is different from the standard VE token model. I don't know of any other protocol that does this. So in the standard model, what happens is you lock your Lifinity for, say, 4 years. Then what happens is that after 4 years, all those tokens you locked unlock all at once. And throughout the 4 years, none of your tokens unlock. It only happens all at the end. And instead, we're making it unlock gradually, linearly over time. So the difference is that in the standard model, it's quite brutal in that even as your VE token balance is decreasing, so you're losing your access to rewards and your voting power, throughout that time, you're not getting any access to the tokens that you locked. And so it can be quite painful, the unlocking process that is. And instead, we think that if you lose some of your VE Lifinity, if it decays a little bit, then however much it decayed, the corresponding amount of Lifinity should be unlocked because you no longer have that VE Lifinity that it represents. And so one of the major reasons for using this model is that it makes locking much more attractive because it gets rid of that brutal unlocking period. And this is important for us because, as we saw in part 1 of our tokenomics, we're going to increase our protocol-owned liquidity. And we're going to do that by selling VE Lifinity, which is locked Lifinity. So people will need to lock their Lifinity when they sell us LP tokens. And so we want to make that a favorable process for those buying the VE Lifinity. If we imagined that we didn't do this and we used the standard model, then people are going to demand a much larger discount on the VE Lifinity to trade their LP tokens for it. And that would mean we acquire less protocol-owned liquidity for each VE Lifinity sold. So yeah, by using this model, we hope to more easily acquire protocol-owned liquidity. Now, some people will wonder, well, what if somebody doesn't want to lock for a really long time, say like 4 years? And so what they do instead is they lock for shorter time periods, but repeatedly. So for example, they could lock for 1 year and do that 4 times in a row instead of just locking for 4 years once. The advantage of that method is that each year they get to reevaluate whether they want to lock for a year one more time. Whereas if you lock for 4 years from the start, you don't get that chance to reevaluate. So what prevents this type of exploit, you might call it, is that you actually get much more VE Lifinity throughout the duration of those 4 years by locking 4 years at the start. So just to walk through a numerical example, say a user locks 100 Lifinity for 4 years. Then throughout those 4 years, they're going to have a time-weighted average of 50 VE Lifinity throughout the 4-year unlocking period. And now we can contrast this with a user who locks the same 100 Lifinity, but this time they lock it for 1 year and they do it 4 times in a row. For this person, their time-weighted average of VE Lifinity would be only 12.5. So they only have 1/4 of the VE Lifinity on average throughout that 4-year period, which means they only get 1/4 of the rewards and 1/4 of the voting power. So it is up to the user if they want that ability to reevaluate more frequently. But the more frequently you're able to reevaluate, it also means the less rewards and voting power you will have throughout that time period. We're also going to be creating a tokenized version of VE Lifinity called X Lifinity. This will only be available for 4-year locked VE Lifinity. So you'll be able to freely convert between VE Lifinity that's locked for 4 years and X Lifinity at a 1-to-1 exchange rate. Unlike VE Lifinity, X Lifinity will be an SPL token, so it'll display in your wallet, it'll be transferable, and you can trade it. We'll make a X Lifinity USDC pool on Serum, but we don't plan to provide any liquidity for it. So there's a few reasons that we want to tokenize VE Lifinity. One is that it enables users to transfer their VE Lifinity to another wallet. So recall that VE Lifinity is not transferable, so it's stuck for your wallet once you set it up there. But if it's locked for 4 years, you'll be able to transfer it via X Lifinity. Another reason is that this enables those who want to exit their 4-year locked VE Lifinity position to do so. They'll likely have to pay a premium, but the good thing is it doesn't create sell pressure for Lifinity because the X Lifinity just goes straight to USDC. Thirdly, this opens the possibility of additional utility for VE Lifinity in the future because once it's an SPL token, it makes it much more interoperable with other protocols. And finally, if we don't do this, other protocols will, and they'll just extract a fee from our users in the process. This is something we've seen with Curve and Convex, where Curve doesn't have a way of tokenizing its VE CRV. And that's where Convex came in and created that for them. But also they take a 16% fee, I believe, in the process. So quite a hefty fee. And yeah, we just think it would be better if we provide the service for free from the start. Now, some of you are going to be wondering why we're making VE Lifinity liquid, when the whole point of locking Lifinity was to make it illiquid. The reason for this is that even if the VE Lifinity becomes liquid by turning it into X Lifinity, the Lifinity that's contained in the VE Lifinity, it remains locked and is not sold. So even if X Lifinity is sold, it's only a matter of owners changing hands. And like I explained earlier, Lifinity, the token itself, does not suffer sell pressure, and other VE Lifinity holders suffer no damage in the process either. So just to give a summary of the three types of tokens that we've mentioned so far. First, we have Lifinity, which is our base token. This token cannot vote. It can be transferred. It does not receive rewards, and you can see its balance in your wallet. Next, we have VE Lifinity. This is locked Lifinity. This one can vote. It cannot be transferred, and it does receive rewards. And its balance is shown on Lifinity's website rather than in your wallet. And third, we have X Lifinity, which is the tokenized version of 4-year locked VE Lifinity. This token can't vote, can be transferred, does not receive rewards, and you can see the balance in your wallet. So it has the same properties as Lifinity. Finally, how are we going to build this? We're going to be building on Tribeca, which is an open source program on Solana that enables protocols to create vote escrowed tokens or VE tokens for their protocol. It has some properties or some features that we would like. Oh yeah, Tribeca is lacking some features right now, and we're going to be adding them, namely the locked state, where when you first receive VE tokens, they are locked and do not decay until you tell it to. And also the linear unlocking feature, where the tokens that are locked in the VE tokens gradually unlock over time rather than all at once at the end. All right, that's it for part 2. Stay tuned for part 3, where we cover voting and bribing. Thanks for listening.